This is our teaching video for the last Sunday of the church year, Christ the King Sunday. Our readings, if you would like to follow along, are going to be Jeremiah, chapter 23, verses 1 through 6. Also, Paul's letter to the church in Colossae, so Colossians chapter 1, 11 through 20. And then finally, Luke chapter 23, part of the story of the Passion of Jesus, 33 through 43. Now, as I tell you every year, Christ the King Sunday is actually the most recent or the newest festival on the church's calendar. So oftentimes when I do these teaching videos, I go back, I give you some context about what you're going to read and how to understand it. But actually, this time I'm going to do a little bit more recent history so that we actually see why Christ the King Sunday was introduced, what was at stake in that introduction, and what it might mean for us today. The first thing we can consider, though, is that if you look at the Gospel reading, that Passion reading, we have the sign above the cross of Jesus that says this is the King of the Jews. And so I've put up on your screen a picture of what that sign could have looked like. And actually in another Gospel, we have that the sign was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. So this is actually from a different Gospel. But so the top says King of the Jews in Greek, and then it says Rex Judaeorum in Latin. And you'll notice there's no J in Latin, so it's an I. And then on the bottom it has King of the Jews in Hebrew. Now, I want to go over actually just a little bit of symbolism, because as it relates to the cross and as it relates to the inscription that you'll read, we see a lot of familiar symbols, but maybe don't know what they mean or we've forgotten. So if you see INRI, that's actually just Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews in Latin. So if you remember, there's no J. Those I's are both for J in Jesus and J in Jews, and then N for Nazareth, R for Rex, for King. So it's just an abbreviation of Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And then actually you'll see this one too. Here you see it on some paraments like we have, but also you see it on the cross. IHS is Greek. So IHS is Greek, and it's actually the first three letters of Jesus in Greek. So it'd be like if I wrote James, and to abbreviate it, I just put J-A-M. When you see IHS, it's just the first three letters of Jesus' name as an abbreviation. So this one is Greek, or excuse me, this one's Latin. This one is Greek, and both of them tie to the name of Jesus. This one ties specifically to the sign on top of the cross, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Now, normally at this time in the video, I'd probably show you a map from Judea or from Babylon or something like that. This is actually a map of the world, and you'll see it's actually a map of vegetation from 1925. And 1925 becomes an important date when we talk about Christ the King Sunday, because 1925 is the first time that the festival is celebrated. Now, the festival first began by this guy, Pope Pius XI, and when you get some context of the world in which he was operating and the church was operating, you'll start to understand why Christ the King was made as a bold proclamation and part of its logic moving forward in the world ahead. So the idea is we have Pope Pius XI, and this is the world in which he lives. And at this time, Pius XI had what he called the Terrible Triangle. And the Terrible Triangle had 1 point in Mexico, had 1 point in Spain, and had the third point in Russia. So if you wanted, we could draw kind of an imaginary triangle like this, and he called it the Terrible Triangle. Now, oftentimes we know about the hardship that was being endured by people in Soviet Russia. We have a little bit of a sense of what was happening in Spain when the church was being persecuted and people were being killed in Spain. But oftentimes we've forgotten, too, that at this time in history, the church in Mexico was being horribly persecuted. So the reason Pius XI called it the Terrible Triangle is you had 5,000 priests who'd been murdered in Mexico. You had priests being murdered in Spain, and not just priests, you had people being imprisoned, Christians, and so on. And then, of course, we know what happened in Soviet Russia. So at this time, too, added on to the Terrible Triangle, we know that we had the National Socialist movement post-World War I in Germany, and Pope Pius XI, his ministry spanned from the end of World War I up to when the Nazis are gaining power in the 30s. And so the man is living in an incredibly difficult age. We're going to talk just a little bit more about that in a minute, but let me just remind you then, this festival was first celebrated in 1925. And as you noticed, or maybe you're asking yourself, well, why is he talking about the Pope and he's talking about the Catholic Church, and how did this end up in the Lutheran Church? And that's a good question, because it started as a Catholic festival in the 20s, and it was actually held at the end of October, not the end of November. And then in 1970, they moved it to the end of November, and this is the time when many of the churches took it on. So the Lutherans, Presbyterians, Episcopalians. The Anglicans may have done it a little bit sooner, I'm not so sure on that history. And then it became an important part of our church calendar too, and now among all these different traditions, you have people sharing this as the end of the church year. Now, if you get a chance, you might actually want to Google the letter that Pope Pius XI wrote when he first introduced Christ the King Sunday, because it's often been overlooked, and it's really actually a very profound piece of literature. But one of the things that they did is 1925 was actually 16 centuries after 325. And 325 AD is an important date because 325 AD is when the Nicene Creed was promulgated in the church. Now, one of the things you might ask yourself is, well, why do we say the Nicene Creed some Sundays, the Apostles' Creed other Sundays, and the like? Well, it depends on the season of the year. So if it's a festival day, we say the Nicene Creed, so Christ the King Sunday, Pentecost. If it's a certain season of the year, Advent, Lent, Easter, we say the Nicene Creed. And then during the rest of the year, we say the Apostles' Creed. And that one Sunday a year, Holy Trinity Sunday, we say the Athanasian Creed. But the Nicene Creed is important because it's the first major pronouncement in a time of controversy of who is this God that we believe in, and what is the way that we relate to this God. So there's a line in there where the Pope draws a direct connection to Christ the King Sunday and what we confess about Jesus in the Creed. So the important language from the Creed is, after Jesus was crucified and resurrected, he ascended into heaven, is seated at the right hand of the Father, will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. And so this idea of the resurrected Jesus as the ruler of all gives us a sense of Jesus not just as like a nice religious guy, but literally, and using the language of the festival, the king of all, the one who has authority over all, and not only those who are living, but those who are dead. We might even say that's how Jesus' authority differs from a normal politician. They can only do things to people who are living. They have no authority over the dead, but Jesus has authority over the living and the dead. Now, one of the things that the Pope wanted to connect then with Christ the King, and again, I would say read the whole document if you're interested in it, is he wanted to talk about Jesus as ruler or king in civil affairs. Now, interestingly enough, when we have this discussion as Americans, we oftentimes talk about the separation of church and state. And really, that conversation has become what we're used to only since the 1940s. So oftentimes a lot of what we think goes back to the beginning of the Republic is actually only since the time of World War II. But oftentimes Americans start to get a little itchy because we say, well, I don't know, separation of church and state. When we say Jesus is the ruler of civil affairs, what does that mean? Well, you also have to remember that the context in which the Pope is writing is different than us. And what he's writing is people who are antagonistic to God, and not only antagonistic, but atheistic. And again, that terrible triangle. And we just have to rattle off some of those countries, Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, and the like, that were either antagonistic or tried to redefine terms, change their meaning, or they were just atheistic. And in fact, Pius XI wrote a wonderful letter to the German church, the only letter ever written in German, directly in German, where he was trying to encourage them in the 30s, around the time of Kristallnacht. And he tells them, look, here's the definitions of very basic words in our faith so that they cannot be redefined. So just because you're using the same word doesn't mean someone can't change the definition on you. So he says, let's be clear about what we're talking about. So when we talk about Christ the King Sunday, we are making a bold proclamation that Jesus doesn't just enjoy life on to the side, but rather Jesus enjoys authority over all things, including our civil and civic life. Now, getting more specifically back to the Lutherans, I would say most Lutheran churches find themselves on this kind of spectrum. On one end, you have an activist church, and on the other hand, you have what's called a quietist church. And this is where most Lutherans have been. All right, so obviously an activist church is a church that's out on the streets, the church that's very involved in politics, the church that's crying out for justice or protesting. The quietist church is the church that pronounces its theological truths and pronounces its heritage, but has nothing to do with the civic life and the government life. They're simply quiet when it comes to that. And of course, you see the opposite then. People who, whenever it comes to the government life, that's like all they do, versus those who do nothing. It might be interesting for you to say, where are you comfortable on this spectrum? Where are you? Where do you think the church should be? Is there a difference between where we are and where you think we should be? And I'm not going to answer that, but I think it's an interesting question for us to think about, because what does it mean that Jesus then is the ruler over all, and not just the ruler of religious things, but really the ruler even of civic life and civil affairs? And especially in a world where governments become anti-God, that becomes a really important question. So it's a question we should be asking on a regular basis. Now, in addition to this spectrum, we can talk about two locations where Christ the King might be applicable. So the first one is interior. And that means, what does it mean for Jesus to come and be the ruler of you, of your mind, of your heart, of your will? So when we say your mind, your thoughts, your heart, a lot of your desires, and your will, your actions when you're going out and doing stuff. What does it mean to say that Jesus has a say over those things, and that Jesus has a shape over those things? Oftentimes in modern life, we see the interior as independent. Probably won't be able to fit it in. We see it as independent, meaning that you can do what you want and not have to answer to anyone. And part of the challenge of this Sunday is to say, no, we will have to answer to God for the life that we've lived. And so how is it that already we can open ourselves completely, or be opened by the Holy Spirit to do that? The second area, or the second location then, is the exterior. And that is really the society in which we live. Now, I'm not going to get into in what specific ways the church should advocate for this, that, or the other thing, kind of on that spectrum, but it's an important question. The church has to be able to speak the good news of Jesus to the society it lives in, not just the individuals in that society. And so where is it that God's vision for life is not being lived out in the way that our life is arranged, our civic life, our institutions, our government, and things like that? So this is a question that we constantly have to raise, and it's not to say there's only ever one answer. There might be conversations, there might be several ways to do the same thing, but the gospel, the good news of Jesus, has to speak to the world in which we live. That conversation of how the good news of Jesus speaks to society actually brings us back to the first reading, which is the cross. Now, if you've seen some of the confirmation videos, you will have seen this window before. It's my favorite stained glass window in the world. It is from the Flossenburg concentration camp in Bavaria, where Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian, was hanged. Admiral Canaris was hanged there, as part of the plot against Hitler. And in this church, which is called Jesus in the Dungeon, which is really a great name for a church, every country that had people die was able to donate a window. And so this is a window, and I wish you could have seen it with the light behind it, because it's really a brilliant window, but the sun's not behind the window, for the French martyrs. So you see it says on the bottom, Martyrum Gallorum, the martyrs of France. And you see it's Jesus hanging on the cross, and then you have two prisoners. One is standing at the foot of the cross, one is sitting. And you see Jesus coming down and embracing the prisoner. And then, of course, his other arm is nailed to the cross. This becomes the church's public witness, the crucified Christ. Because remember, Jesus says to Pilate and to the prisoners who are with him, his kingdom is not of our world, meaning what God is up to is not playing our political games. The game that God is playing is very different. And so we see that in the way that Jesus rules as with the weapons of his love. And in fact, his love is the only thing that overcomes the hate and the death that we see typified in a place like Flossenburg. But it's Jesus on the cross in solidarity with the suffering of the world, and that becomes a kind of standard for the church to have a public voice. The crucified Christ in solidarity with the suffering of the world, with a view to what God's intentions are for human beings and human life. And not just our life, but actually then the life of the whole world, and if Jesus is the ruler of all, even the life of the whole universe. And so when we talk about Christ the King Sunday, it's no mistake that at the heart of the gospel is the cross. And now, I want to show you one more thing about the cross. If you've noticed the cross that we use for the Taizé prayer, it looks like this. Well, it doesn't quite look like that, but it has a thing up here like this, and then like this. Now, this is a Russian Orthodox cross, but this gets us finally back to the end of the Gospel, too. Now, obviously, the cross shape, which we know, this is the sign, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, or here is the King of the Jews, and then this is the footplate. And oftentimes, the Russian cross, the footplate is at a diagonal. And that has different meanings. I mean, one simply could be it's Jesus standing on it and it moves it. Another meaning is the thief that Jesus says, "You will be with me in paradise," is on this side. The thief who says, "Can't you save yourselves," is on this side. And the idea that this thief is going with Jesus to paradise, pointing up, and that this thief rejecting Jesus doesn't go with them. Now, that's maybe a whole separate conversation, but I'm giving you some sense of the symbolism of the cross that you see in our church. Nonetheless, what's important is the interchange between the people who are crucified with Jesus and the one over here who sees in the midst of pain and suffering the truth of what God is doing. And we might say that this is our challenge as the church, to be able to see in the midst of darkness, pain, suffering, and death what God is actually up to, and to be witnesses to that, to have a voice in that, and not simply to go about with our heads covered. In fact, when Christ the King Sunday was instituted, part of what was discussed was called a conspiracy of silence. And when the church would talk about a conspiracy of silence, people knew that Christians were being persecuted in Mexico, people knew Christians were being persecuted in Spain and Russia, but no one was saying anything. And in fact, if you look at the letter Pius XI wrote to the German church decrying a lot of the Nazi ideology about race and identity, that was another instance where he was decrying the conspiracy of silence. The church has to be able to speak, because if the church is silent, then it's kind of a conspiratorial allowance that the stuff is okay. And there's a lot of stuff in the world that isn't okay, that God has a bigger vision for it. And the reason the church has authority to speak is the one on whose behalf we speak is the one who is ruler of all. Well, I hope this video gives you some context of Christ the King. I hope it actually asks you or raises some questions for you, just about, okay, what does that mean to have Jesus be Lord of our civic life? And especially when we're not in a country, at least not now, like as Americans in the 21st century, that's overtly hostile to Christianity, like some of the countries that were encountered in the 20th century. And just ask yourself, what does it mean to share the witness of the good news, and what does that look like concretely? We'll look forward to seeing you on Sunday for the last Sunday of the church here. Christ the King.